Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Fotheringham. I'm the Managing Director of AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest webinar in our research webinar series. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout our nation as we pay respect to elders past and present. We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's connections to land, sea and community, and respect their cultural, spiritual and educational practices. For those who don't know us, AHURI is the only organisation in Australia dedicated exclusively to housing, homelessness, cities and related urban research. Through our national network of university partners, we undertake research that supports policy development at all levels of government and assists industry in improving practice as well as informing the broader community. In addition to publishing research, we also run events like this webinar and the Australian Homelessness Conference. Our next conference is coming up in October, the 7th to 8th of October 2026, up in Darwin, and the program is out now, so have a look at that and get onto what is a really exciting looking program. Before I introduce our speakers, though, I have a few housekeeping messages. Today's webinar will be discussing the report Short-Term Rental Accommodation, Models, Impacts and Policy Responses, and it's available now on the AHURI website. If you want to refer to it during this webinar, though, it's also available in the handout sections to the right of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the AHURI website in the coming days. We have also opened the chat function in the webinar, which can also be found to the right of the presenters on the presentation screen. Feel free to add your comments and questions through that chat function. So let's focus on today's speakers. Our key presenter today is Professor Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban Planning and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney. Nicole is the lead author of the report. It's a mouthful, that title. Nicole is the lead author of the report we're discussing today, working with researchers from the University of Sydney, University of New South Wales and University College Dublin. I'd also like to welcome Kelly Grigsby, CEO of the Municipal Association of Victoria. Both our presenters have very interesting and impressive careers, and you can find out more by reading their bios on the AHURI website. Today's webinar will run for an hour. First, Nicole will give a short presentation about the research. Then we'll bring Kelly into the discussion, informed by the questions many of you have sent through when you registered, as well as any questions you ask through the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. I will note we're not going to have time to respond to every question. We'll try to draw out the key themes and get to as many as we can. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nicole.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm joining you from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders of that country. And I also just want to acknowledge the co-authors, the co-researchers of this study, as Michael said, from the University of Sydney, New South Wales and University College Dublin. This is such a hot and important topic, and I'm so glad you've been able to join us to discuss it. I'm going to try and get through, I guess, a high-level overview of what's in the report in 15 minutes. I hope that Michael's promised to jump up and down if I go on for too long, but we do cover a range of materials. So just to give you a sense of what we looked at, we're building on some previous studies looking at the range and the spatial distribution of short-term rental accommodation and how those listings have changed over time, what that means for local and regional housing markets and, of course, communities. But then in particular, this study looked at the different types of short-term rental accommodation, I guess, models and the business implications, which is very important for understanding how potential regulatory responses might affect provider decisions. And in looking at both quantitative data, we also sought industry, stakeholder and local government views. So, as I said, we're building on a big body of previous research, although this research is only 10 years old because it's such a new phenomenon. And in fact, myself and my colleague Peter Phibbs wrote what still appears to be the first peer-reviewed article on short-term rentals published in a planning journal in 2017. But there's been a wave around the world actually of short-term rentals enabled by platforms since about 2011, but particularly 2016, part of the global hypermobility that some members of the world are able to be part of second home tourism, which of course has been a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon, but particularly enabled by platforms, which has then begun to intersect with the financialisation of housing and the idea of housing as an investment. Now, what this has meant for local communities and housing markets has been quite extreme in the places where short-term rentals have really predominated. And that's led to a body of research as well about how to regulate this issue and the particular challenges of regulation, given that the industry is enabled by international global platforms. So this study began with that international evidence, but then drilled down to customised data sets provided by independent source inside Airbnb, as well as case study analyses looking at some indicators, which I'll share with you in a moment, as well as some financial modelling to understand the business parameters of short-term rentals in Australia. So our case studies were across Greater Sydney, as well as the New South Wales South Coast and Hobart. And when we talk about measuring indicators, sorry, my children are dancing for my attention online, sorry about that. But when we look at measuring impacts, we're limited in the range of measures that we have. We're limited based on the data availability. Housing data is not as perfect as we would like. Certainly data about short-term rentals isn't as perfect as we'd like either. But this is a handy set of indicators that we use, but that we think is also useful for policymakers at state and local levels. So things like the composition of listings, which I'll get into in a moment, the proportion of listings managed by a commercial provider, the density of short-term rentals relative to the overall housing stock, but then particularly relative to the rental stock and the rental vacancy rate becomes really important. And then when we're trying to understand the financial motivations of providers, but also the potential impacts on rents, we can then look at median rental incomes from short-term rentals, either whole homes or when you share part of your home, as a proportion of median rents and mortgages. So let's look at the national picture. By December 2024, there are almost 175,000 listings on Airbnb. Other data sources might show slightly different data, but based on independent source inside Airbnb, we're talking about around 175,000 listings nationwide. That's equivalent to 1.6% of the housing stock, which for some people might not sound very much, but if you consider rental vacancy rates, and when we consider that this is the entire housing stock, not the third of the housing that's in the rental market, you start to see that even at the national level, this is not an issue that is insignificant. And then when we drill down to the local level, we see, of course, a clustering around particular tourist areas, but also central city areas of the major metropolitan regions. Now, the listings are a mix of whole homes as well as private rooms and shared rooms. Now, interestingly, the period that we analysed, 2022 to 2024, there was growth overall at the national level of about 10%, which again is a significant level of growth. But that was coming off a drop in the COVID period when, international borders were shut, and globally, in fact, there was a significant drop in short-term rental listings around the world, and then this recovery post-COVID. But more interestingly, I guess, and potentially concerningly, the biggest growth in Australia, that 10% growth, was in unhosted properties, which are the ones that we're most concerned about as potentially absorbing permanent rental housing, and nearly 60%, so nearly 2/3, managed by a commercial provider. So again, indicating that we're not talking about, me renting out my house when I'm lucky enough to travel, overseas at Christmas. And so this is a good point to introduce the different types of short-term rental accommodation. Many of you will be aware of this distinction. So we distinguish in this report between primary residences, which are whole properties available for less than 90 days. So that's me renting out my home if I'm lucky enough to go away. We're not really worried about that in terms of a potential housing market impact. In fact, some people say there are financial benefits to homeowners from doing that. The second type, again, is associated with minor, if any, housing market impacts, and that's when I might rent out a room, I might host tourists, I live near the airport, might have some people. Obviously, my home needs to be well presented and my children need to be well behaved. But there's that type of, the real shared housing that we imagine when we think about when we originally heard about Airbnb. That's really a resident sharing their home with guests for money, although it may, of course, include some backpacker hostels. But what we're really concerned about is whole homes that are available for more than a threshold, and the best threshold we're able to impose is around 3 months in a calendar year. That really indicates a property that is not available as permanent housing stock. And when you see growth in this type of listing, it really sends warning bells that we might be losing long-term rental housing. So now to look at the listing trends between that crucial period, end of April 21, we've got some data for our case studies through to December 24. And we see in City of Sydney and in Waverley that real drop that I talked about, reflecting the COVID era impact. But actually in our tourist case studies, so even Hobart, but also the New South Wales South Coast, actually there was a modest rise over this period. And so this is just one of the important illustrations of the regional differences that you see when you look at short-term rentals. When we compare the impacts, for instance, of short-term rental accommodation as a proportion of the rental stock, looks particularly alarming in Shoalhaven, where the number of short-term rentals is equivalent to 2/3 of the permanent rental stock. In City of Sydney, Blue Mountains appears to be less, but this is just as a proportion of the rental stock. When we look at rental vacancies, it's more concerning again. For the City of Sydney, for instance, in April 21, the short-term rental stock was equivalent to around 30% of rental vacancies in the City of Sydney. That rested at 60% of rental vacancies by 2024. A doubling, actually, of impact. And of course, that reflects the shrinking of the rental vacancy rate in central Sydney, but still highlights the exacerbation that short-term rentals have on tight rental markets. And so we see as rental vacancy rate, and I won't attempt to go through this in any great detail, you can read the report, but just to illustrate, you can see that as rental vacancy rates drop in Greater Sydney, rents increase, of course, and the significance of short-term rentals as a proportion of the rental stock rises, further exacerbated by the fact that the actual number of short-term rentals did rise over that period of short-term whole properties available pretty much for the entire calendar year. Now, we had some other data available to us in Hobart, and so looking, because there's a system of permitting short-term rental stock. There's not a system for not permitting it, unfortunately, but the permitting system, so an application for a permit to host a short-term rental, does allow us to track in Hobart properties that previously did have were in the long-term rental market, to see the proportion of properties that actually have been taken off the rental market in Hobart. And our researchers found that of the sample that they were able to look at, so permitted properties between 2018 to 2023 in Hobart, of those, 2/3 were formerly in the long-term rental market. Now, looking at the incentives of providers, all of this might lead you to think that providers of short-term rental are motivated by money, and to some extent that may be true, but it really depends on the characteristics of the local and the regional housing market, as well as the type and the location of the short-term rental property itself. So, for instance, in Sydney, certainly a property investor does appear to have a more financial incentive to let a 2 and 3 bedroom property as a short-term rental, rather than putting it on the long-term rental market, although that calculus shifted during the COVID period, of course. But in high-cost rental markets, and sometimes that even includes places like, for instance, Byron Bay and the Far North Coast, there can even be a stronger financial incentive to offer the property on the long-term rental market. So again, I won't get into the detailed modelling, it's in the report, but this simply shows that if you owned a 3-bedroom house in the centre of Sydney, so in the city of Sydney, you could make more money offering it on the short-term rental market than the long-term rental stock, and you only needed to have occupancy of 140 days per year, which is under the threshold cap in Sydney, which I'll get to in a moment, but you only needed 140 days occupancy to be financially ahead, and that's even taking into account the additional costs associated with managing a short-term rental property. So all of this, now I'll just turn briefly now to the stakeholder perspectives, but certainly it gives us a picture of a short-term rental sector that's increasingly professionalised, but doesn't mean necessarily that property owners are always motivated by higher financial returns, which makes it quite complicated to manage through regulatory measures. Certainly metropolitan area where there's less a tradition of, even pied-à-terres as there are in, New York and London, metropolitan owners of short-term renters do seem to be seeking higher rental returns. But in regional areas, being able to access the property for their own purposes is often as or more important. There's also a perspective from stakeholders that short-term rental accommodation could play a stronger role. If we do have this temporary housing stock, it could actually be activated. But to do that in times of housing emergency, we need a proper policy framework to make that happen in an organised, efficient and cost-effective way. So I've only got a minute or so left, and I just want to finish on the regulatory piece, which I know we're going to talk about. We've heard, and it is true, that internationally you have cities banning short-term rentals. Certainly that's occurred in New York City, strongly regulating them, places like Amsterdam and other, European cities. And in France, they go so far as to say for every long-term rental you take out of the market and turn into a short-term rental, you need to replace it with the same amount of residential floor space. That's pretty intense. But in Australia, we don't have anywhere near that level of response. We've got the states only now moving to require registration. We've got a bed levy, which is very new in Victoria, 7.5% nightly levy. We've got some local councils imposing higher rates. We've got a very high permit fee that's just been imposed in Hobart, although many permits have already been issued. I think, interestingly, we've got state planning frameworks, particularly in Western Australia, allowing a very local response, which can be nuanced. So in a tourist area like, and this is Busselton, right near the coast, in Busselton, short-term rentals are probably always going to be, probably always have been, part of the visitor economy. But in the rest of the LGA, where you get new housing supply, the council wants to protect that for permanent housing needs. As I said, a permitting system in Tasmania, but also the Tasmanian government has been able to require the platforms to share their data, and now we can use that data. They're making it available to everyone to see, so you can at least monitor the situation. And in monitoring, it doesn't appear to be good news. We're seeing continued growth in short-term rentals in Tasmania, and so obviously more work will need to be done there if we're talking about preserving the permanent rental stock. Some interesting financial incentives too to operators to return properties back to the long-term rental market. So in conclusion, and in the report, we say there is a role for all three levels of government. The Commonwealth level could really drive platform accountability. And of course, as we've seen recently, they do govern the tax settings which influence investor decisions in the housing space. The state level, they do have registers. I think it's fair to say those registers probably got their training wheels still on. Maybe Tasmania is the exception there. But the states need to enable local planning responses, ensure there's sufficient resourcing for enforcement where there are regulations in place, protect renters to make sure that that they're not going to receive an eviction notice as properties are transferred to the short-term rental market, and then provide some real support to help property owners who may wish to transition their home back to the long-term rental market, as well as that emergency housing policy piece I mentioned. And at the local level, if there's a key message, it's that short-term rentals need to be planned for and considered as part of the wider planning for housing supply, and also the other economic activities such as tourism that go into strategic planning for locality and a region. And with that, I'll thank you and hand back to Michael.
Thanks, Nicole. There's a lot to unpack there, so we'll try and get through as much of it as we can in the next half hour or so. Kelly, I want to turn to you now and perhaps get your perspective before we come to audience questions.
Thank you, and it's been a really informative report, and thank you for all of your work. In fact, I think it's come at a really important part of our housing journey more broadly. We've seen right across local government that different lived experience, depending on where you are. In regional Victoria, for instance, as compared to, up in northern Queensland. So I think we know that all three levels of government have got those regulatory levers, but they are fragmented, as you've highlighted in the report, which is really precisely why we do need that whole of government approach to dealing with this issue. It is quite nuanced when you get down into the sort of place-based analysis, particularly looking, as you said, at those tourism economies in some of the regional areas. But equally, we hear these places, these regional towns talking about worker housing shortage and just how difficult it is to actually continue to house people to support important industry, but also the tourism industry itself. So yes, it's absolutely timely, and I think when we've got a government focused on housing affordability and these issues more generally, now is the time to look at that national framework to really help support how we can implement something that is nuanced at the local level. We did talk earlier about the need to be cognizant of that. There are geographies and communities who have got particular needs, so we need to be mindful of that. But certainly places like Hobart, where you've had a serious housing crisis from an affordability perspective, the price of rentals at one point was, astronomical. They've been quite proactive in looking at how they regulate that. And we're seeing communities across other parts of Australia doing the same things, often led by local government. But as you say in the report, I think one of the key challenges is really that access to data. And, that sort of more joined up federal approach will make a real difference, I think. And there is a lot, as you say in the report, to learn from some of these international examples where they've been a little more proactive. Our sort of, state jurisdiction response has been somewhat slower than it perhaps needs to be. And I think we've got an opportunity now, whilst we've got a kind of nation that is focused on housing, to really pull as many of those levers as we can. That's probably all from me. Thanks, Michael, for now.
No, thanks, Kelly. I'm going to pick up on that, actually. And one of the things that struck me, and clearly from questions coming through as people registered and in the chat function, is the enforcement in Australia, or regulation in Australia, has moved more slowly than in some other countries that have been impacted by this. From your perspective, Kelly, what do we need to do in terms of both effective responses, but also, I guess, managing the politics of this? Because it is a slightly contested space. Is that a challenge at a local government level, or is it a question of federation?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. And I think the response to this has been clearly uneven politically, right across the country. I think the biggest challenge from a local government perspective, there's probably two key things. You've got some state jurisdictions that are actively undergoing planning reform at the moment. So Victoria has literally just updated its Planning and Environment Act for the first time, since the 80s. So there is opportunity to start to sort of look at how we regulate and the instruments around, some of those changes to the Planning and Environment Act are coming into effect, that being sort of codified now. New South Wales similarly. So, I think there's an opportunity to really look at how we can embed that sort of framework and that guidance into the state legislation. But ultimately, at a local level, there's just such disparity in council's ability to administer a regulatory kind of environment. And I think we have to be really cognizant of that. And that's why I think there needs to be a sort of, at least a national framing about what this looks like as a framework, and then how we support that at a state and then local level, because I think otherwise you've got some councils who are already doing work of their own volition in this space. We've seen places like Mornington Peninsula and others have their local policy provisions within their own planning schemes, but it is burdensome to kind of administer, particularly if we're not, as a level of government, getting access to the right data and information to inform decision making. So I think there's quite a bit of work to do there. But yes, it's certainly something I think overall local government has the appetite to do. We do share the concerns and certainly support the evidence and understand it's great, a new, more up-to-date evidence we have now in this report to respond to, but it does need to be a really joined up whole of government approach.
And Nicole, I'm conscious that one of your final slides there was looking at the roles of different tiers of government. I think it's really important to try and coordinate those. It's one of the real challenges, and there's lots of different things happening across the country. And one of the things, one of the reforms I'm conscious of in Western Australia recently that wasn't part of this report, but perhaps you might like to comment on, the mandatory scheme amendments over there.
Yeah, I'm a planner, but really short-term rentals do have a spatial impact, both beneficial and, and negative. There's a lot of, even the ways that communities, local residents experience short-term rentals is impacted even by the dwelling typology and, how close they are together and the settlement type and, whether there's shops even in the local area. So really a spatial approach first and foremost is, I think, a really good starting point when it comes to short-term rentals. So Western Australia actually allowing a planned approach, and you do that by identifying short-term rental of a dwelling house as a particular use that's different to, the way that permanent residents live in a house, for instance. So that's a starting point as a planner. And then you're able to say, now, is that a use that we need to regulate or not? And in certain circumstances, it will be something to plan for. And in other circumstances, it simply won't be, or that may change over time. So in Western Australia, allowing local councils to use the planning system and then to use their zoning powers to say there's certain places where short-term rentals can occur without the need for permission and assessment. And there's other areas where we do where they're not prioritised or not a preferred use, so we want to consider applications on a case-by-case basis. That really is the tried and true way of, balancing the different uses of urban space, I suppose, and trying to distinguish, for instance, between whether you want all of your visitor economy to be accommodated in your residential housing stock, or whether you want to have a balanced, accommodation offering and, plan properly for hotels, motels, resorts, etc. So again, it comes back to the local planning system. But if we compare, for instance, the Western Australian approach to the New South Wales approach and even to Tasmania, now in theory, in New South Wales, you can also use a spatial planning model, which Byron Bay have demonstrated in identifying parts of their shire where you can have unrestricted short-term rentals, and other parts more residential in character where you can't. Now, for Byron to enact that change, it was a very costly process of needing to demonstrate evidence, and a very long process of amending the planning scheme. When we talk about enabling local planning responses, I think we want to reduce the burden of councils, particularly given that a short sort of shift in demand, like a short increase in demand for short-term rentals, at the same time as you're getting a sudden influx of, new housing demand, needs a quick response. And if we make local planning responses too long and tortuous, then, we're tying local councils' hands up, if that makes sense.
Thank you. One of the questions that's come through from a couple of people, Nicole, just I guess a bit of a nuance in your presentation and in the report is that concept of the non-monetary benefits in the regions being a key part. Can you talk a little bit more about what we mean by non-monetary benefits? I think the financial benefits are obvious.
So you mean for the owners of holiday homes? Yeah. And look, this is something that definitely will bear housing researchers in the future to consider. But for instance, we go back to second homes even before platforms. We know that the people before their retirement might actually buy a second home in a regional area with the idea that they will retire there, or, when they reduce their working pattern, they may live there part of the time and commute back to the city part of the time. And so we know that's part of the landscape. For instance, sometimes it's called amenity migration. It's also associated with the people can access income from almost anywhere now. And certainly in the COVID period, we saw, again, this big rise in remote and more flexible work patterns. So we know that that is actually part of the way that people are using homes. And at the same time, we also have to recognise that particularly in the COVID period and beyond, there was a sudden increase by investors just to look at investing in residential stock. And we do know from some of our interviews that those investors who felt priced out of the city then looked at regional areas and were attracted by the relatively lower price and the ability to finance that investment by platform renting, plus tax incentives, plus the benefit that they could then also use the property themselves when it wasn't being let out. So those are some of the non-financial benefits, I suppose. But there is also, some people have had second homes in their family, for a long period of time. And so the benefit of putting it on the short-term rental market may be that the property's managed professionally, looked after when they're not using it, for instance. That's another thing that comes up, and it's worth acknowledging. And it's worth acknowledging as well the regional economy around managing second home tourism and the employment. So what as researchers we're trying to do is thread a needle through this. Say we need to understand what's going on and then tailor the regulatory response to understand all of these issues.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm anecdotally aware of some cases of people who siblings who own a property collectively because their parents bought it as a beach house, and a large number of siblings, and actually having someone centrally managing it rather than one of the siblings taking on that role can reduce tension. Right.
And then it's simply a matter of making sure that we're not incentivizing, more loss of potential permanent housing, but yes.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in your presentation the role of the federal government and tax settings being one of the things they signal. A number of people have asked whether the tax reforms announced on budget night, yet to pass, but announced on budget night, will have a meaningful impact on short-term rental accommodation. I've seen some reports that Brisbane City Council, the largest local council in the country, announcing it's not going to go ahead with some of its plans around permit requirements and attributing that to those tax changes. Is there a direct relationship here?
I don't think there's enough evidence to be able to pinpoint that, but it's certainly the fact that until some recent clarifications, as I understand it, I'm not a tax expert, so anything I say about tax, obviously, go talk to your accountant. But reading the Financial Review, for instance, the ATO has said that they're going to look more closely at people negatively gearing properties that may appear to be holiday rentals, but to date, negative gearing has been one of the things that impacts the financials for property investors, and that goes for property investors of second homes as well as, people investing in the long-term rental market. So shifting that may disincentivise future purchases in the space of existing property. Less so of new property, but of course that would be a second concern in a regional area where you don't get a lot of new housing supply. The last thing you'd want would be aspiring second home investors to purchase the new housing stock due to a taxation incentive. I don't, imagine that would occur, but we would want to monitor the situation, certainly. But that the financial calculus of purchasing an existing property in a market where short-term rentals may yield a higher return than long-term rentals, that incentive is taken away, I suppose, with the negative gearing changes and the capital gain changes as well.
And yes, this webinar does not constitute personal financial advice. Kelly, the interplay between those federal settings, state-based policy settings or regulation, and the role of local governments. I mean, to what extent are local governments looking to the state and the federal government for a lead on this, and to what extent are they driving the discussion?
Look, I think one of the things that's covered in the report, which is really around the case for a national register, I think that would be, from a local government perspective, what we need to be able to sort of implement, a response to this appropriately. I think really understanding that sort of infrastructure layer would help unlock both the sort of tax compliance and effective local regulation elements as well. I think that's certainly something that we would welcome and would make it easier, for us to sort of administer at the local level. But as you've seen, through some of the case studies and just, knowing councils, both in Victoria but also interstate, there's different approaches already being applied. There is permitting requirements, and there was a comment earlier in the chat about Airbnb, for instance, that's already required under some planning schemes. But you've got councils really taking the lead where they need to in this space, because they've had these very pressing sort of urgent issues to deal with. But I think, like anything, it's trying to avoid some of those unintended consequences. And from a capacity perspective and impost at the local level, we need to make sure that, you know, councils have got the right tools in place to be able to administer something appropriately, but also recognising the nuancing that needs to happen at the local level, you know, based on what Nicole was saying earlier around, you know, particular communities, and, you know, things like neighbourhood character overlays particularly can kind of apply as well. Like, there's many different tools, but I think how we set this up in a national context, you know, really is the key here.
Nicole, how do you see the regulation of short-term rentals sitting within a broader housing policy umbrella, and also, for that matter, a planning policy umbrella? You know, how does it integrate with other dimensions of housing policy, social housing provision, build to rent, and so on and so on?
Yeah, that's a big loaded question, and it's an important one because we haven't actually asked that. You know, I think there's been a real sense, both a policy sense, but also amongst, you know, housing researchers, maybe even until very, very recently, that, you know, really short-term rentals is just part of tourism. It's not even actually a central part of housing policy, which is strange, because one of the things, if you could snap your fingers and have access to a temporary housing stock, and it's right underneath your, you know, right there, you don't need to build it, none of the friction associated with anything that usually you don't need to move it around, it's right there. You know, I mean, it would have changed things, you know, in the bushfire period, for instance, post-flood, even COVID, when we were looking for places for people to safely quarantine. It did exist, but we weren't able to snap our fingers and access it, because the only way through was through individual, you know, hosts and, you know, existing booking commitments and variable rental charges, etc. Now, it's easy to imagine actually a Commonwealth or a state being able to say, this is part of our infrastructure, short-term rental stock is part of the housing, the total housing stock, and we simply need a policy framework to be able to access that during times of emergencies in ways that are safe and fair. So that would be one example of folding, you know, a short-term rental stock into housing policy. But another way to think about it is part of the reason why you see this outsized impact of short-term rentals in a place like Shoalhaven, for instance, or Hobart, where they're equivalent to, you know, 30% of the rental stock, is because there isn't a large enough or a diverse enough affordable rental stock in the long-term housing market, and we don't have enough protections for permanent renters. In fact, in New South Wales, change of property use, including to a short-term rental, might be one of the ways in which, I don't want to give anyone ideas, but certainly that's not an illegitimate reason to serve an eviction notice. So protecting renters, for instance, and making sure we've got sufficient social and affordable housing and a diverse and appropriate, you know, and affordable long-term rental housing stock, that is another way to think about, you know, where short-term rentals fit in the market, because they won't have an impact if we've got sufficient housing choice elsewhere. Look, I could go on, Michael, but there's probably two ideas I'll sit with.
And they're fascinating ideas, and it strikes me, and some of our audience as well, that, you know, that stock does exist, but in a different form, and it's hotels. So in the pandemic, we went to the hotels, we went to the traditional tourist accommodation for that. So, you know, we've sort of reinvented it all. There's a sort of circularity there.
Yeah, well, look, if I can just say, one of the biggest ironies, and I have been researching short-term rentals for a decade, but one of the biggest ironies is that you see the bottom of the tourist stock, in fact, redundant tourist stock. This is particularly so in regional areas, but it's also, across suburban areas, certainly in the CBD as well. You see the lowest tourist stock being used as temporary crisis or, some kind of default housing for people who can't get into, the rental market in any other way. And that's an indictment too. And, you call it innovation or call it a problem, but you see firms in regional towns, I'm thinking even Basque Coast, and it's great leadership, for instance, where you've got agricultural firms, for instance, purchasing or leasing a motel to provide accommodation for workers. But you've got new homes in Basque Coast sitting empty when tourists aren't using them. And so, it's kind of topsy-turvy.
And that comes with risks. There are risks for employees when they're both employed and housed by the same organisation. There's somewhat of liberty. So that's not a perfect model
as well. But certainly, the tourist stock is not well designed for long-term housing, and probably vice versa. But if I could also say, just on that hotels and motels during COVID, what that does also show is that if you're seeking emergency accommodation in a rush, one address that you can physically see and you know where it is, that's who you're going to call. And I think that also helps explain, why the formal tourist stock was appropriated rather than accessing the, informal housing stock, if you like. But a policy framework could remedy that.
So, Kelly, the tourism argument on this is it's a key dimension to short-term rentals. It's a key reason for it. Particularly for, I guess, regional councils, but also for inner city councils. How do you balance the need for accommodation for tourism, but also accommodation for people working and supporting tourism, working in hospitality, for example?
Yeah, well, I think this is what we've seen across the country, and particularly in some places in Victoria where the communities have sort of been hollowed out by short-term accommodation because you've got, housing stock, as you've been discussing, sort of sitting, waiting for people to rent on short-term basis. They're not contributing to the community necessarily. They don't have kids attending schools. They're not participants in the local economy, ongoing. And this is the balancing act, particularly with some of these smaller regional communities that they've got to contend with. So I think it's about getting the balance right, and making sure that, there are the guardrails in place to help manage short-term rentals as to not, undermine the sort of community building and sort of local economies of a lot of these places across Australia. So, I think these are the key things that need to be addressed. And I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I think it is about getting that sort of integrated housing policy right. Obviously the tax settings that we've talked about previously, but also, that framework nationally to sort of help support, state jurisdictions, but also local councils work with their communities to address these issues. I know there's many other things raised, like amenity and so on, and, nuisance and poor behaviour and impact on, on sort of permanent residents in places. But I do think they are more secondary considerations. I think the fundamental issue here is really about housing for people and building, resilient and thriving communities. And we want this to be a contributor to that, not a complete underminer of it. And I think that's the risk that we have at the moment, is that that balance is just not right in some places. But in others, as you say, Michael, I have councils talking to me about how they value, short-term accommodation, because they wouldn't be able to get the level of tourism, if they were relying simply on, traditional motels, hotels. They just wouldn't have that level of investment or, visitation to support a local community. So that's why we have to be really mindful of a place-based approach to this, albeit within the context of a sort of national framework that sets those broader, guardrails.
Thank you. There's some really interesting discussion going on in the chat. I couldn't possibly keep up with all of it, but there's an interesting question there around the light touch regulation, let's call it, in Australia of short-term rentals, and to what extent is that opening the door for more serious issues around trafficking of people, getting to the point where it's, I noticed, you had whole of house, single room or shared room, and you do end up at the hotbedding end of things, which is hopefully not an area we're going to get to in this country. But to what extent is it an open door that allows more serious issues to start creeping in?
I mean, I think we've seen that already. We've seen boarding houses, in inner parts of, Melbourne, I'm sure in Sydney. So, traditionally prior to these platforms, you did have, boarding houses and other accommodation that, certainly councils had oversight of from an environmental health, regulatory perspective. And, so there is certainly ongoing concern about that. But I think that's something that has been there for a while. It's how, but yes, your point, in terms of how we manage that inherent risk is something we need to be mindful of. But that has existed, I think, previously.
I would like to say something to that as well. And it is, until there is a disaster, it is tempting to, not take those concerns seriously. But one of the things that does keep me awake at night sometimes, and I know a lot of building inspectors, is just remembering, the backpacker fire situation. And I'm not in a position to say whether shared rooms, for instance, on platforms are a smaller version of backpacker hostels, whether they're dormitory beds or whatever. But I would say that they're concerns that need to be taken seriously. Initially, the idea was, well, this is a market system and you don't need regulation because the market will regulate. And by that, they mean, reviews. So if you stay in a, squalid bunk bed dormitory that seems overcrowded and risky, give a bad review, and then, the operator will lift their game. We're moving off housing now. But to get back to housing, the answer when we don't have knowledge about those potential risks is back to require registration and make that registration, a proper, verifiable, reliable registration system. To do that, we need platforms to be accountable. So we're not just reliant on individuals volunteering accurate information, because platforms take things away from being able to see things in the real world. You don't necessarily know from the street what's going on. You only know on the platform. So we need the platforms to share their data so that it can be verified. So then, and with the platforms being accountable and transparent, we then need to resource the enforcement mechanisms at the local level. And from there, whatever policy framework is appropriate, considering the local and the regional housing needs, you can overlay that. But those first things, register, platform accountability and transparency, and then being able to monitor the situation, I think those are baselines. And I don't think we do have those ingredients always in place.
Yeah. Thanks, Nicole. There's a leading question here that I'm going to put to you both, and I'm not going to, actually, Nicole, I'm going to put it to you first because it might be unfair to give it to you, Kelly, which is really, several hundred councils in Australia, I think it's 538. How do you sell a policy to a council that actually is more interested in protecting property owners' rights than on regulating this sort of market that is essentially resistant to the idea of more regulation in this space? What's the case you put forward to them, Nicole?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, but it's the same as any policy area that needs evidence. Here we've been hamstrung by lack of evidence around housing market impacts, but now they are emerging. So yeah, it's a case of evidence, but I do think the states need to take some leadership in this space. And given we're in a country that can only say, when you say housing affordability, the only thing people can say is housing supply, and yet this is one housing supply that we're content to, not manage. Yeah, that's probably my position.
Mm.
Michael, I also think we make assumptions about people's knowledge of these sorts of wicked problems as well. Certainly, I think where we've seen councils really taking the lead on this issue, they have taken, a position where they've really educated and sort of brought the community along with them to actually understand, the unintended consequences of some of their decisions around what they're doing with their second property. And I saw that conversation playing out in real time in some of our communities, people who had actually had their second property being used as an Airbnb, once they attended some, sessions that council were running or, community conversations that were going on, they actually made the decision to return their homes to, long-term rentals. So I think, sometimes it's about levelling up and understanding the sorts of social impacts of these decisions and, giving people the sort of right information to be able to make an informed choice about what they do with their own properties.
That brings up, I guess, a really interesting final question. We're going to run out of time, but actually, before I do that, there are lots of technical questions or questions about specific locations in the chat, more than we can possibly get to, but also quite detailed in some of them. I would really encourage people to look at the report, which is an absolute page turner. It's worth the read. There's a lot of information there that we can't cover in this hour. But on that point, Kelly, about returning properties to long-term rental, I mean, to what extent is that the aspiration here, or is it about trying to stem the tide? Nicole, do you have a view on that?
Well, I do think that's a good question. One of the standout findings is that once a property has been used as a short-term rental, it's not easy to simply flip it back to the long-term rental market. And so there does need to be support in place, and particularly if there's a desire to, use it for a temporary period of time back in the long-term rental market, say for 3 years or 4 years, in response to a real, housing shortage, for instance, in a regional area. But in terms of the regulation and the impact of regulation, we don't have strong evidence on whether you introduce a regulation and then properties will go back to the long-term rental market, except in central Sydney and except in the areas, where the COVID made a real dent. And there, actually, the market downturn resulted in properties going back to the long-term rental market rather than a regulatory intervention.
All right, look, we have reached the end of our time slot, and I really want to thank Nicole and Kelly for what has been a really engrossing conversation. I'm going to encourage both of you to have a look at the chat, because there's been another engrossing conversation there, lots of great examples to wade through. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in that afterwards myself. But thank you both for sharing your knowledge with this audience. Just three quick things before we wrap up. Struggling with that today. We'd appreciate your feedback by completing a survey that'll be sent to you today. We promise it's very short, to the point, but we do want to continuously improve these sessions. We'll also send you an email letting you know when the video of today's session is available online. And if you're interested in hearing about future webinars, keep an eye out for the AHURI news in your inbox. On a personal note, this is my final AHURI webinar and in fact my final public appearance as the Managing Director of AHURI. Thank you all for your engagement with the work we've been doing, and that continues on after I leave this month, and it's been a terrific experience all around. Thanks for joining us today. We look
Michael, I'm interrupting to tell everybody that on behalf of the housing research community in Australia, thank you for your efforts over, more than a decade, 2 decades.
Not
the
quite,
legacy, almost 2 decades, certainly as long as I've been researching in the space, Michael has been a really important supporter and enabler, and then shown tremendous leadership behind the scenes, more than we could ever imagine, but also as the front face of AHURI as well. Such an important, often a very brave role. People listening might not be aware that I have been able to bask internationally in the good reputation that AHURI has offered the Australian housing research community, and that's thanks to Michael's efforts and the efforts of the team that he has led, over many years. An extraordinarily well qualified, professional, dedicated team. I could do another hour of tribute, but I'll wind myself up there. But thank you, Michael, and congratulations on what you've achieved and your legacy.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. It's been an absolute pleasure. It is a team effort. And the team will be available again to be seen up in Darwin at the Homelessness Conference in October. And look, I'm going to try and get there myself as well. So look, thank you all very much.